Hi, everyone. Today, me and Tete are going to be talking about her new Tapas series, Scale, Blood, and Bone, and what made her want to leave DeviantArt and put it on Tapas instead of DeviantArt. So, to begin with, let's talk about what Scale, Blood, and Bone is and what inspired it.
Hi there. It's so great to be back on the podcast. There's been a bit of an absence. So, yes, I think what inspired me to write Scale, Blood, and Bone, I think it came from your work itself, the book of Joel, and just seeing how Joel had this journey. He had such a deep journey, and it went beyond just the usual, gamut of the whole build 'em strong and kind of journey. It went more deeper. It settled on not one period, but certain periods, and it showed the growth therein. And, most of these things show the growth of expanding out, but this is about growing inwardly. And I thought more and more on the topic of that, and I began to think, what corresponds with that? And this was also at a time where I was sort of on a tipping scale of whether or not to leave fantasy or not. And I felt dissatisfied with a lot of fantasy. And I thought, well, what if something was psychologically compelling in fantasy rather than just, the whole big magic world building? Oh, there's dragons. But I figured, why not make something psychologically compelling with dragons? And I believe that's how the book of Scale, Blood, and Bone came to be, was from your work, the book of Joel, and just seeing Joel's growth and development, but also the different characters like Malka, his parents, but mostly between Joel and Malka, and especially Joel's complicated inner mental landscape of himself.
Definitely. And you really translated a lot of these things and how Joel grows as well as his own complex mental landscape into fantasy.
Yes, definitely. I try to stay very, true and accurate, to how Joel is. I tried to correspond many of his traits into what would be, sort of a fantasy medieval setting. But at the same time, I think some things had altered with Joel, but not entirely. I think they just translate different because of the context of the time. The fact that he's in a different position and he's had different connections and different relationships because of the context of his upbringing and environment, which, Joel compared to Joel, as he's known in the series, it differs quite a bit.
Definitely. So what trait do you think differs the most?
I think it's the trait of, I think it's the trait of ambition. I think that Joel himself opportunity to create his own ambition, while Joel, on the other hand, feels that his future is kind of trapped and it's pretty much set in stone what it will be. And I think this is that it's that pressure that causes Joel um, to turn to other means to gain what he thinks needs his power. Meanwhile, Canon Joel himself, he realizes there's different opportunities for different ambitions he could do. And I think he realizes those freedom of opportunities. So I think it makes him a more freer person, but at the same time, we get to see his kind of self-sabotaging nature more at play. While Joel, I think he does have a self-sabotaging nature, but it's kind of more unaware because what he thinks what he thinks is helping him is actually destroying him and everything around him. So I guess it's awareness and ambition, the double A's, if
Mhm.
you will.
That's a very good point. I think Jules, because he lives in a more complex world and has more complex politics because of the role he's born into, he doesn't really have the luxury to be so self-reflective per se, because he's focused on the goals. But then Joel, he doesn't have any preset goals, and he's okay with not having any ambitions. He's not really like Sam, who wants to be famous at all cost.
Exactly, exactly. So definitely, there's definitely more. Like I said, there's because he throws himself personally into these goals. Than what would be a more healthier way of doing it is detaching yourself from the goal and simply focusing on the goal as a separate entity. He sees those as interchangeable and just something you cannot inseparable, just because he's been born into that role, and he's been kind of pressured with all these expectations, um, perhaps from his mother, but I think more so from the people around him. And I think he also feels somewhat inadequate, where I think as Ken and Joel, I don't think he has these deep-seated feelings of inadequacy, or rather they're in a different context than Joel.
Hmm. I think Joel is more concerned about his ability to act out the role he's in, but then Joel, his inadequacies are all about how he presents himself as a person.
Very much so, very much so. In some ways it's a bit similar because it's about presentation and execution, you know. Um, I think Joel, Canon Joel, is more reflective on his own sense of self, while Joel, it's more connected, like you said, to an actual role he's been born into, and the pressure of that.
Exactly. Right. And I think, we talked about this before. If Joel and Joel met, I think Joel would be kind of shocked how Joel doesn't seem to have a solid goal, but he doesn't realize that I think it has to do a lot with the time frame because in Joel's time frame, a lot of people don't have a preset goal or being born into anything except for like I guess some people who are born into generational wealth or something.
That's true. We have hypothesized these different conversations between these two, and I think Joel is quite shocked. Joel, because of the time frame he's in, he's thinking in that time frame, which is very macro, while Joel, Ken and Joel, is more micro. And I think this is where these two don't realize how they have different context of the time and what different times they're living with, because Joel has all these opportunities, whereas Joel does not. But then at the same time, um, how do I say? There's different pressures. I mean, I think with Joel, it's the sense of self, and trying to move into and move through society,
Mhm.
as a functioning member, and to build up that sense of self dignity, that we all have in a modern society. While Joel, on the other hand, he doesn't really need to do that. But what worries Joel is that he has to fulfill this very enormous role he's been given, and he feels very inadequate, and he's very, very stressed about the pressure, which is why he turns to, if you will, darker things, what he thinks will
Mhm.
help him achieve greatness.
Definitely. One question that some of our followers had, especially Helivorn, whose question came to mind, was that how did we, collaborate on this series? Was there a collaboration, or was it mostly just brainstorming and then you taking it and basically kind of surprising everyone, including myself?
I think I'd like to say in the beginning it was a bit of the former, but now I think it's been more of the latter now. I think we did brainstorm a great deal about it. I think we do brainstorm. Um, I think you and I were hypothesizing back and forth what a fantasy AU would be like. And I think we were thinking about how would a D&D session go. And we were
Oh,
thinking,
right.
yeah,
Yes.
we were thinking about that in fantasy, Joel. And, you have to think of like, oh, cool name. So I thought of Joel, like SZ, like I thought, oh, that'll look cool. Um, you'd be surprised in these D&D games how, like, sessions, I should say, the crazy spellings people come up with. But yeah, we were brainstorming about that, and I think, when was that? I think it was back in April, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Because I remember the first
I think
time we
it was
really
April.
talked about
But yeah,
oh, sorry, because it was of the internet lag, so I spoke over you.
oh no, that's all right. That's all right. I actually didn't hear what you said. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just saying that yeah, I remember it was April because I remember seeing some of the first convos we had about Scale Blood and Bone were in May, and my drawing, my draw this in your own style, which was inspired by Joel and Malka from Scale Blood and Bone, was done in mid-May. So I think we started talking about this back in like late April, if that's the case.
I think we did. I think we did. And so we began to brainstorm on that, and the story took shape. And I asked you what would happen if I wrote fanfic, because I love writing. Um, let's face it, we'll call it what it is, fan fiction of your work. You had given me the green light, you'd given me your blessing, and I think heavily I went back and forth with you, consulting to you what would be accurate, what would be true. And you worked out all the kinks, if you will, because I think originally in a lot of the original concepts, there were lots of problems. I think they were a lot over dramatic. A lot of them followed, your classic grim, dark, medieval fantasy tropes. And you helped me to create something much more nuanced and balanced. And I think from there it took root. It kind of just turned from a rivulet to a full-blown river now.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And we even have the standees of the characters of
We
both
do.
versions.
We have the standees of both versions, and I love them. I have them on my shelf, which I'll be showing a better shelf now. But I am just so happy with them. They're beautiful.
I know. I can't wait to make more reels and pictures of them.
Yeah, they're beautiful, and I'm gonna. Oh, I want to make little theaters and just have them do little plays.
I know. And Sam, I have the standee of Sam. He will be, videographing that.
Oh my gosh, he would be. He'll be the director. You need to get him one of those little mini megaphone things.
He would, yes. Just like in Amanda's Draw This in Your Own Style entry.
Yes, yes, exactly, exactly. Oh, Sam.
Sam will be in this series too, along with Frankie.
Yes, yes, he will. They will go by different names. Sam will be Samuel, and he'll be a magician slash bard, great lover in quotation marks. Uh,
Sexual magic practitioner.
I think so. He claims so. He claims so. He claims to specialize in fertility, and I guess he's kind of like Yarilo, and he says he can bless the fields and make them grow, but I guess he's making other fields grow.
Of course. And we don't, and I think some people found out that he was kind of exaggerating or outright lying in some cases.
Yeah, there were some people who were chasing him out of town. He was running, he's running with his little guitar on his back, and um, he's bouncing from town to town. I think he's a little bit, he's quite a bit like Jaskier from the Witcher, I think. Although more outrageous and more ambitious. He's not going to settle for being a bard. He wants to be a great magician and not a wizard or a sorcerer. He says, oh, I'm not to that dark stuff. No, but fertility and love. And he's definitely a chaotic type. And we're going to see Frankie. His name will be Fahid, and he will be kind of a paladin champion, defending people from monsters and injustice and stuff.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very interesting. I will be drawing, well, I already released, The Fool featuring Sam kind of dressed like as Samuel would be in Scale, Blood and Bone. And in a future tarot card, I'm sure, Fahid will be making an entrance too. Because, I think one of the reasons why I haven't drawn him yet is because you haven't. Because you did do some sketches of Jules and Malka as well as Samuel, but not yet Fahid. So I'm waiting for you to do some
Fahid.
sketches of him before I do anything.
Yeah, I need to do Fahid pretty soon. I think he's going to have more of a, I think the internet lagged.
Mm-hmm, it is. Yeah, guys, I'm really sorry for the lag.
Lagged. Uh, yeah, I think you said you were waiting for me to draw Fahid so you would have a better reference
Mm-hmm,
of what he looks like.
exactly. Mm-hmm,
Right. So they definitely, I think he's going to have more of a Middle Eastern approach, if you will, which is
mm-hmm.
something you don't see a lot in fantasy, but yeah, definitely. So I think Fahid and Samuel, I guess they're going to make like they're kind of like Geralt and Jaskier, but of course both of them I think are more equal, yet at the same time separately ambitious, and I think they're more on the bright path, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Right. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Right. And also, we also want to talk a little bit about in this episode why you chose to post the series on Tapas rather than on DeviantArt, which, in the past you had focused on almost exclusively.
Yes, yes. For the longest time, I had made a Tapas account, but I practically ignored it. I thought, will I ever use it? What's the point? And I just focused exclusively on DeviantArt. I would post previews on Instagram and that sort of thing. Uh, but I think why I chose Tapas, I think it belays a bigger reason, which I think we'll delve into in just a moment. But I feel that Tapas is more literature friendly. It's more user friendly. It's more professional. It allows you to do things in a novel format, where DeviantArt, especially with its new settings of Eclipse, which, just for the record, I really loathe and dislike, is not at all literature friendly. Style changes. And for someone like me and other people, some of us have trouble reading text on screen just because of photosensitivity. And, not that we're nearsighted, but, we do kind of need bigger letters or better font. And it's just hard for us just to read a whole little wall of text with these little letters and Arial font. And DeviantArt did not provide any kind of customization. It was very, very difficult to use. Plus, I felt there were a lot of other problems within DeviantArt as well, especially for literary writers.
Hmm. Was there anything else about DeviantArt that prompted you to leave? Something about the interaction that was a bit lacking?
Yes, I would have to say so. While I was very grateful for many of the interactions on DeviantArt, I was very thankful for all the wonderful memories it gave me and how it helped me to grow from a, kind of a directionless teen to a more focused woman now. There were a lot of things, I think, in the fantasy community that I felt lacking, and I felt very let down because I felt like I was forced to always have this perfect standard of performance and always meet the audience's expectation, because you would put something out there. When we put something out there, the audience would not be able to fully comprehend it, or they would misinterpret it, and you would feel bad if you had to say, well, it's actually like this. Then also too, it just led to a lot of info dumping rather than concise, meaningful comments that help give you feedback as readers. So you have everyone who's thinking it as thinkers, which is a nice thing, but not as a reader. And I think that's not a good relationship between a writer and the people reading it. I think, one needs to, because the problem with fantasy is that many readers think that they are the writer themselves. And this is all right to some degree, but it can kind of get frustrating when you feel like they're overriding your agency as an author. And it's not that you want to be the great big monarch on the hill, but it's just that you yourself can only know your characters. Or, maybe there are people like, say, you and I, we seem to know each other's characters very well, judging on how we interact. But, maybe for the other audience, they haven't had those long, 4-hour conversations about character analysis and in-depth discussion. They've only read maybe 1 or 2 chapters or seen a snippet of artwork here and there. So that was another thing. It was just that interaction. It felt more like info dumping. It felt more like, everyone's trying to build their own world on what I have. And it sort of felt like a bulldozer. Someone came in with a bulldozer, bulldozed what I had, and tried to interimpose what they thought. And I didn't
Hmm.
want to contradict that. So I left and I went to Tapas, and it's been rewarding since. I'm not really sorry that I left DeviantArt. I sometimes missed some of the interactions, but Tapas has been very fulfilling so far. And I'm hoping I can build an audience. So far, I've had, built a very good audience. It's been a very meaningful audience. So shout out to everybody who watches this podcast, all the Tapas people. I love you. Thank you.
Definitely. I think the comments on Tapas are more to the point and less info dumping. They're actually taking the time to read what you have written rather than give you interpretations of what they think, right?
Exactly, exactly. That's what means a lot, is when someone actually takes time to read through the whole thing, rather than say, oh, and they choose little snippets to info dump on. And, like I said, I'm not saying that I'm not ungrateful, that I'm not saying that I'm ungrateful towards what happened on DeviantArt, but I feel like this is a lot more helpful to me to grow as a writer. Because also to DeviantArt, everything's meant to be taken artistically. Art and literature are very different. People want to say they're interchangeable. They are not. These are mediums that have to be processed, thought through, ruminated, and then, projected back onto in a very different matter. Literature is more concise, it's more to the point. Yes, you can elaborate and elucidate, but that has to be through a different format, through your own perception, rather than trying to sort of build your own story and interpretation, which is what art does in that
Hmm.
medium of context.
Very good point. What I think also one of the reasons why you had that info dumping with DeviantArt was because you were in OC training. And sometimes some of the stuff in OC training was, required in order to process to the next step. So some people, they didn't know you, they weren't invested in your work, but they had to do it because they were assigned to you. They had to trade comment for comment, or they had to comment on a certain thing because you were in their group, right? So maybe that was one of the reasons why you got these kind of comments.
That's true. That's true. I will always have fond memories of OC training, especially the first rounds. I think my first 3 rounds were the best. Andrei, Gerda, and Frostlord, which in future podcasts we'll be talking about the delineation of Frostlord to somebody else. Spoiler alert.
Hmm.
Um, but yes, you're right. It's because people have to process it that way. You have to move to the next point, and people have to make assumptions about your character because all you're presenting is a piece of artwork. Try to make it interpretive as impossible. Try to convey as much as you can into one image, which is why I was always doing 3 or 4 comic pages, like, oh no, I need to tell all this in one, because they did not allow literature, which I understand, linguistic barriers, all sorts of things. Art speaks is a universal language. But like I said, I've always felt I've been more of a writer first and an artist second, which, don't get me wrong, I will be getting back into the art saddle. Um, but I can do a lot more with literature than I can with art as far as my talents are concerned. And I just felt it wasn't the place to grow. And the format of OC training is very good for getting out the basics, but not for an audience to really analyze and to understand a character very well, because you're just doing the bare bone structure of it.
Hmm. Very true. Exactly. I mean, OC trading is a great place to start to, think about characters that you don't really know a lot about. So it makes you think more things about them. But yeah, in the long run, I mean, for people like, and especially certain characters that aren't plot driven, right? Like we talked about, if Joel and Malka were on DeviantArt and they went through OC training, we're not really sure how I could, show certain traits of theirs. Really, for example, what is their wish? It's very hard to show.
That would be very hard. I mean, OC training is very good for, I think, more plot driven characters, because you can summarize something in a plot in a visual image that's symbolic. But characters such as Joel and Malka, they could not easily translate or convert over to the structure OC training. And I myself have had difficulties with that with all my characters. I had it with Andrei. I had to do like, a 2 comic book page type of thing. Gerda was the same thing. I really didn't know how to do her wish. So, or Kai, I had to make 3 different wishes because he has 3 different aspects of himself.
Hmm.
So that was very difficult. And you're right. It's good for a lot of plot driven things, but I think for you and I, our characters are more psychologically driven.
Exactly, exactly. And for Joel's story, for example, he doesn't really have a plot.
No, I mean, as, honestly, if we were like back in, if we were back in 5th grade and we had to do those book reports, that would be a difficult thing to do. Like you're reading, it's kind of like, when you're in 8th or 10th grade and they make you do Moby Dick as a book report. You're like, guy on ship, chasing whale. There's a dude with a peg leg named Ahab. The end. They die.
Right, exactly. So it's always the emphasis on the external rather than the internal, which for some stories, it's all about the internal. Like, James Joyce's Ulysses, all of Roth's work, most modern literary stuff.
Exactly, exactly. Modern literature forces us to, uh, or rather invites us in many ways, to look inwardly in the sense of self, and the journey of that growth, or maybe the self destruction thereof. rather than being plot driven. I mean, you kind of see that gradual shift and change. Like, for example, when you look at the major shift in romanticism, and then, that's kind of paving the way to realism, then to naturalism, and it just goes in steps. You go from like plot driven stuff like Dickens, which isn't really psychologically compelling, no offense. Then you get to, like, say, Bronte. I'm sorry, Dickens. I'm sorry, I had to. Just, I don't need to know about, or Hugo. Sometimes I don't need to know about 10 different people at the same time. I just want to know what happened to this one poor man. Um, and then you get on to, some of the more deeper romantics, like, I don't consider Dickens romantic, but he's just there. Like the Brontes. I probably butchered their name. I always thought it was Bronte, but then you get on to more and more and more, and then you get into modernism and naturalism. Then then we get into people like Joyce, then we get into people like Roth and all the other paragons of literature. But yes, so it's not all plot driven, and unfortunately, so much of the fantasy genre is unfortunately plot driven. It will rely heavily on emotional tropes, and sometimes it will psychologically get in deep, but it's always going to be connected, to events and not really a sense of self. And I think with Scale, Blood and Bone, was that I wanted to explore something where, yes, it begins out as something that could be plot driven, but in the end, it's all about what's the internal drive and journey therein inside oneself. Um, which, I wanted it to have that modern, fresh take, rather than just feel like, oh, plot A must be done and plot B is fulfilled and all that.
Definitely, right. So I think in another sense, Jules and Malka would probably have an easier time going through OC training, though it's not that easy still compared to Joel and Malka.
They might, I think, but not really, because as we see as the story progresses, Joel and Malka are rather complex. They feel like they need to be simple because everyone's telling them to be simple and fulfill a role and, all this. But then as they have a journey of themselves with not only their own respective selves, but together, they realize they're far more complicated. Like, for example, Joel's wish initially might be that he could be a wise and great, powerful ruler, like the
Mm-hmm.
greatness of his mother, or maybe even surpassing his mother.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Malka's wish would probably be in the beginning just to have sort of a quiet, content, domestic type of life, kind of cottagecore or something. Um, not a cottagecore, but maybe palatial core, if that's a term. Um, but as they grow and begin, their desires and their own sense of self become more complicated, and then that way wish could not be just fulfilled in one singular visual motif. It would have to be other things. I won't reveal what those desires will be, because they're going to be multifaceted, just like other people. We just don't have one wish. We
Mm-hmm.
have multiple
That's
wishes that
true. Mm-hmm.
expand and to branch into different aspects.
Mm-hmm. Except for Sam, I think he really just does have one wish, which is to become famous.
That's only one wish. I know he's only got one wish, and that's to take the world by storm. If he cannot be the Valentino or Tomaszewski of the Lower East Side, then I guess he's going to become the precursor to Steven Spielberg, which I would love to see. Stand
Mm-hmm.
with that camera.
So that's why Sam went through OC training. I think it was nearly 4 years ago. 4 years ago.
It was 2017. Golly gee, I think
Yeah.
that's what I think. After you finished with Sam, I threw Andrei in
Yes, you
2018.
did.
I
Yes, you
did.
did.
I
Yes.
did. Cossack man.
Right. So yeah, Sam ironically is the easiest to do, I think. It's Joel and Malka and Joel and Malka, which would be harder.
Very hard, very hard. And thinking on that, Andrei was kind of easy. He's kind of simplistic in a way, isn't he? I mean,
I think
he
he
has
is.
singular goal.
Well,
Yeah,
back then he
just
was more
wants to.
simple. back
Now he's more
then.
complicated.
He's
Yeah, I
more
think he's more of a
complicated
happy.
now. He's less idealistic too. Because back then you said what he liked the most was being with his wife, Dasha.
I know, and that's changed. I don't want to disappoint anybody out there who loved Andrei's idealism, but unfortunately, Andrei is, to quote Elvis Presley, a hound dog.
He is. I mean, he's not someone who just loves his wife and no one else. Because back then you said he only loves his wife, remember?
That's true. The problem is with Andrei is that he loves every woman that he meets. It's like that Hosier song, Someone New.
Exactly. And I think this fits him a lot better because before it felt like you were trying to cram him into a square, sorry, he was a square peg being, crammed into a round one because it felt like other aspects of him were very much like the Cossacks in Quiet Flows the Dawn. But except for
Right.
that one, except for, oh, he was very loyal to his wife. He doesn't think about other women at all because he just loves Dasha so much, remember?
I remember, and there wasn't much interesting about Dasha, unfortunately. Um, but yes, Andrei, I guess you guys have already seen the podcast with Tamara. Um, yeah, Andrei is not idealistic. He has a lot of flaws and setbacks. He loves every woman that he sees. I think within the course of 3 months, he's probably maybe dated and went out and have had grand passions with, I don't know, at least several women. But
Hmm.
he's like Gaston, except he hates hunting and he's not misogynistic.
Right, exactly. So he's a very passionate guy, and not just passionate with his wife, which was how he was like in OC training.
No, he's any you know, any devushkas that he meets.
Another thing was that Dasha, unfortunately, like I understand that she grew up with him, but one of the weaknesses of the story was that if he was so loyal to her and so in love with her, we never see what kind of connection they have and why they love each other so much, other than
That's
being
true.
childhood friends.
That's true, we didn't. I tried to force a narrative, but it didn't work. Also, people grow and change. We're not the same people we were when we were children or even teenagers or even a few years ago. And unfortunately, sometimes those connections fade and break. And I guess not to deviate, but then of course there came the origins of Tamara, who is now Andrei's wife, although he's not exclusively loyal to her. He feels bad about it, but he can't help himself. I mean, Devushka's, um, meets a pretty girl on a train. Um,
Katya?
you know, yeah, in about an hour they're flirting, and I don't know, the next day he goes and buys her a rug. This is how quick he moves. He hustles for the bread.
Oh, he does. Yeah, I think this is a lot more realistic and it doesn't and also his relationships with these different women, even his affairs feel a lot more organic than what he had with Dasha.
Far more, because even in an ideal world with an ideal man, it doesn't feel realistic. A man of Andrei's amount of passion and grandeur, it would demand that he would probably fall in love with every, kind and pretty woman he meets. And for him, it's not so much, oh, this woman has great qualities, but rather he loves the excitement of flirting and just the idea of being alive and tension, if you will. He just
Mhm.
loves that. And I think he likes the act of love more than the person themselves. But, like I said, he's not completely heartless. I mean, he's not looking at women like conquests or anything. It's just
Mhm.
he sees it as a wonderful pleasure that you have to take. And I think what really further hammered that in was the fact that, he survives World War One, he survives the Civil War, he survives, prison and everything. So I guess that what makes him further kind of greedy for pleasure, because he's thinking, I don't know when I'm going to die. I don't know when the state suddenly gets it in its head to go shooting people, or I get accused of something, or we die of starvation, because you have to remember he was in the
Mhm.
South, so lots of starvation unfortunately going on. So
Yeah.
that's why he's very greedy for pleasure, and it's like, well, I don't know if I'm going to live tomorrow, so I'm going to um flirt with this woman and make grand passion with her.
Right,
So I died of
right. Right. And in our next podcast episode, we'll be talking more about, Jules and Malka and how they meet. But I guess in one word, how would you describe, okay, from Andrei's perspective, since we were talking about that, how would he think of Jules versus Joel and how they interact with both versions of Malka? Does he fail Andrei's love test like Sam keeps on failing his love test?
Canon Joel does not. Canon Joel, I think, aces Andrei's left because it was a little like, how to say, like the meme. They had us in the first half, not gonna lie. So Andrei thinks in the beginning Joel didn't have, the hot spot to do it. But then in the end, he really made a grand finale, and Andrei's like, thumbs up from Andrei. Joel, on the other hand, I think if Andrei were to see the whole context, this is more played out, what's more elongated over the years than Joel and Malka, because just the context and stuff that's happening. But I think Andrei would be like, had a good beginning, rough middle, but great end. So, thumbs up from Andrei.
Right. And I think for people who didn't follow some of our podcasts, why exactly does Andrei think that Sam fails his test in all universes?
No matter what. Andrei feels like, yes, be confident as a lover. Yes, well but Andrei feels like you really need to deliver the goods to be a great lover. And he feels that Sam doesn't do that. He feels that Sam just simply stands there like a pampered brat. And he's like, if he had to give a grade, he's like, F for you, Sam.
How about the dean?
But the dean gets no grade. It's like, I don't even know how to grade him. And he throws his papers down. This is horrible.
So he's much worse than Sam. Oh, sorry, it's the lag.
I'm sorry. I think we're having the internet lag.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, crappy
Yeah.
internet.
But yes.
But I think you were saying the dean fails, so
Yeah, much more than Sam, right?
much more than Sam. So yeah, Andrei gives A's to both Ken and Joel, and Joel, um, both A's to both men. Sam gets an F, the dean gets no grade, and everyone else gets a C plus.
And what does he himself get if he grades
Um,
himself?
he gets an A plus and 10 credits.
Of course. He has to place himself as the model, right?
Andrei thinks of himself as a model lover. I mean, shortcoming. Like I said, he does get a bit emotional, like Stanley from not violent or abusive, but I mean, he will cry out your window in the rain. Probably tear his shirt off.
Yes. So thank you so much for explaining why you decided to, migrate from DeviantArt to Tapas. I think it has also really boosted your productivity, which we can talk about in a future podcast. And, thanks so much for your hard work on Scale, Blood and Bone. And I'm really happy to learn that, my work has inspired such an amazing series from you.
Thank you. It truly has, and it continues to do so. It has actually inspired me to work and reevaluate a lot of other characters that people from DeviantArt might be familiar with, but maybe not on Tapas. So I would definitely love to talk about how Joel and Malka inspired some other characters as well in the next future upcoming podcasts as well.
Definitely. And I think these characters are a reinterpretation of older ones, right?
Definitely. I think a lot of people are going to be quite shocked who these are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So stay tuned for future podcasts, guys.
Thank you guys. Please stay in touch. Look at all the LinkedIn link trees, everything. And thank you guys for supporting us. And thank you all for the Tapas supporters. I love you guys. Thank you for commenting. And I love your work. I really do. Thank you. Writers Unite.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.